Viewers' discretion is advised. Welcome to Two Perspective Global Conflicts Explained, where history is told. To fully understand why Korea, among many other nations, still harbor deep resentment and hatred for Japan, even after almost 6 decades of democratic governance and relation building on the world stage, we must first look at the beginning of the Rising Sun Empire. During the Keijo period, 1865 to 1868, in Japan was characterized by political turmoil, social unrest, and the beginnings of modernization. As the Tokugawa shogunate's grip on power weakened, dissatisfaction among the populace grew, fueled by economic disparities and foreign pressures. This period witnessed Japan's opening to the West, with the arrival of foreign ships heralding the introduction of Western technology and ideas. Amidst this backdrop, preparations for modernization began, laying the groundwork for the sweeping reforms of the subsequent Meiji era. The Keijo period marked a significant transition in Japanese history, setting the stage for Japan's rapid transformation into a modern nation-state. After the Keijo period came the Meiji period. The Meiji period, spanning from 1868 to 1912, was a transformative era in Japanese history, characterized by rapid modernization and societal change. Beginning with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, which ended centuries of feudal rule under the Tokugawa shogunate. The period saw the centralization of power under the emperor and the establishment of a modern nation-state. Key features of the Meiji period included extensive industrialization and the adoption of Western technology, which propelled Japan into the ranks of major industrial powers. This era also witnessed significant westernization, with the adoption of Western political institutions, legal systems, and educational practices. The Meiji government pursued an aggressive policy of expansionism, leading to conflicts such as the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and the occupation of Korea, which established Japan as a dominant force in East Asia. In 1874, the Meiji government made its first major move towards expansion, the annexation of the Ryukyu Islands. This marked a significant step in Japan's journey towards becoming an imperial power. The pretext for this annexation was the deaths of Ryukyuan fishermen, an incident that Japan capitalized on to extend its territorial borders. China, which had a long-standing relationship with the Ryukyu kingdom, lodged protests against this move. However, these protests proved to be in vain as Japan's determination to expand its influence remained unyielding. Despite the international controversy, by 1879 the islands had been fully incorporated into Japan, marking a critical point in the nation's growing power and ambition. This annexation of the Ryukyu Islands was an early display of Japan's expansionist strategies, a clear indication of the direction the Meiji government was heading. With this, Japan set a precedent for its future territorial acquisitions. The Ryukyu Islands were the first but not the last to experience the force of Japan's expansionist strategies. Just 2 decades after the Meiji Restoration, Japan shocked the world with its victory in the Sino-Japanese War. It was the year 1894, and tensions were escalating between Japan and China. The spark that ignited this conflict was Japan's support for a rebellion in Korea, a country under China's sphere of influence. Japan, eager to flex its newfound power, saw this as an opportunity to challenge China's dominance in East Asia. The Meiji government, drawing from their Western counterparts, had modernized their military, adopting advanced weaponry and tactics. This strategic overhaul was a stark departure from the samurai tradition, marking a new era in Japanese warfare. China, on the other hand, despite its vast resources and manpower, was ill-prepared for the onslaught. Its military, marred by corruption and outdated tactics, found itself outmatched by Japan's westernized forces. The war was brutal and swift. Japan's advanced military proved superior on both land and sea, leading to decisive victories that stunned the global community. China, unable to withstand Japan's onslaught, was forced to cede Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands and pay considerable war indemnities. This conflict reshaped the political landscape of East Asia. The balance of power shifted away from China, paving the way for Japan to assert itself as a dominant force in the region. The victory also had profound implications for Japan's national identity. It bolstered national pride and further validated the Meiji government's decision to modernize. Japan, once seen as an isolated island nation, had now announced itself on the world stage as a formidable global power. Yet this newfound status came at a cost. The Sino-Japanese War marked the beginning of Japan's imperialistic ambitions, setting the stage for future conflicts and conquests. In the years to come, Japan's thirst for expansion would lead to further wars, occupations, and ultimately its downfall. This victory marked Japan's arrival as a formidable global power. A power that, similar to the Western empires of old, would leave a deep, festering wound across Asia and indeed the world, in ways that still hurt those victims to this day. In 1898, Japan again set its sight on a target for its military might, this time against Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. This was a pivotal moment in Japan's imperial history, as it sought to expand its sphere of influence and power and gain dominion over the Korean peninsula and Manchuria. The stage was set for the Russo-Japanese War with the signing of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. This move was strategic, a protective measure against other European powers' imperial ambitions. Japan, emerging as a new power, sought the friendship of Britain and established global force. Together, they hoped to keep Russia's expansion in check. But alliances alone don't win wars. It was Japan's audacious surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur that truly marked the beginning of the conflict. In an era where declaring war before beginning hostilities was customary, this move was a shock to the world. The Russo-Japanese War was not just a series of battles on land and sea. It was a demonstration of Japan's westernized military prowess, a presentation of their adaptability and strategic planning. Japan's victory over a European power was unprecedented, a David defeating Goliath moment in world history. The war concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by none other than the US President Theodore Roosevelt. The treaty granted Japan significant territorial gains, including the southern half of Sakhalin Island and the lease of the Liaodong Peninsula where Port Arthur was located. This was more than a simple victory. It was an acknowledgement of Japan's rising status on the global stage. But the Russo-Japanese War was not without its costs. An enormous number of lives were lost, resources depleted, and the seeds of future conflicts sown. Yet it was a significant step towards Japan's goal of expansion and prominence on the global stage. It was a clear signal to the world that Japan was no longer a tiny nation on the periphery, but a central figure in the shaping of the 20th century. In 1909, Japan embarked on its most ambitious and ruthless expansion yet, the annexation of Korea. The Korean peninsula, a neighbor with deep-rooted cultural and historical ties, was to become the next victim of Japan's imperialistic ambitions. Japan's iron grip over Korea tightened after the Treaty of Portsmouth, and any opposition was brutally suppressed. The Korean people resisted, but their voices were viciously silenced, their protests crushed under the ultra-nationalist hand of the Japanese military. The annexation wasn't merely territorial. It was a systematic and brutal eradication of Korea's national and cultural identity. Japan enforced a policy of cultural assimilation that actively wiped out anything non-Japanese. They instituted a strict policy that all education and governmental paperwork were to be written and spoken in Japanese, essentially killing the Korean language. They brought a newly constructed education system that belittled and relegated Korean culture and traditions to mere passing mentions, instead focusing on indoctrinating the children they were oppressing into believing the Japanese empire and people were pseudo-gods. Schools were Japanized, Korean language newspapers were banned, and Shinto, the state religion of Japan, was forcefully imposed. But the assault on identity was only one aspect of the horrors that the Korean people endured. There was also the economic exploitation of Korea's resources and people. The Japanese Empire, gearing up for further expansion and war, required resources and manpower. Korea was forced to provide both. Koreans were conscripted into the Japanese military and forced to fight for a cause that was not their own. Men, women, and even children were subjected to forced slave labor, working in harsh conditions with no regard for their well-being. The most horrifying aspect of this exploitation was the use of Korean women as comfort women, a euphemism for sexual slaves for the Japanese military. With the war dwindling material goods, food, and jobs, Japanese officials, along with the help of other recruiters who were civilians, recruited young women in Korea, in hopes of helping provide for their family during the brutal Japanese rule. Many of these women were told that they were going to work in factories, and others were simply forced or kidnapped by recruiters. Lee Ok-seon was running an errand for her parents when it happened. A group of uniformed men burst out of a car, attacked her, and dragged her into the vehicle. The 14-year-old girl would go on to never see her parents again. Comfort stations were set up to house many of these young Korean women who were now known as comfort women. The Japanese military ordered the women to become the soldiers' sex slaves. It established a licensed prostitution system to meet the desires of Japanese soldiers. If even possible things got worse, age limitations were going unnoticed, as the girls were getting younger and younger, and the recruiters were bringing in uneducated and naive young girls, which made them a perfect target for the stations. Comfort women were not allowed to be pregnant nor carry any diseases. They were checked on a regular basis, because if the girls were in good condition for the soldiers, that would help them win the war. If any girls resisted, they were killed instantly. There was no way out, no hope, and no escape. Many of the comfort women would not be able to live the normal family life after Imperial Japan's defeat to the United States. In 1945 and 1946, when the comfort women returned to Korea, they came back as Hwangyang-nyo. To the Koreans around them, they were neither faithful nor chaste. The families of comfort women feared the ostracism they would suffer if the shameful past was discovered. The women became an extra burden. Countless Korean women victims stayed quiet after the incident due to the societal shaming of the family. Many of the women would go on and live in shame for the rest of their lives, not only for not being able to marry, become a mother, but forced to live in society where the pain and hatred for the Imperial Japanese was thrust upon these innocent girls suffering brutal wounds at the hand of Japan. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese had killed roughly 350,000 Korean men, women, and children, with hundreds of thousands more suffering from the atrocities imparted on them by the Imperial Army. With the echoes of battle still ringing in the air, the once formidable Imperial Japanese army found itself defeated, its dream of an empire shattered, its atrocities finally coming to an end for the Korean people. The United States dealt the decisive blow with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The final years of Imperial Japan were marked by a psychotic struggle for survival on the part of the Japanese government and people. With resources dwindling and allies falling, the once proud empire found itself on the back foot, fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. Its westernized military, once the envy of Asia, was stretched to the breaking point, unable to stem the tide of Allied advances. The dream of a greater Japanese empire was crumbling, and with it, the myth of Japanese invincibility. In Korea, the fall of Imperial Japan was met with a mix of relief and trepidation. For decades, the Korean people had endured the brutal yoke of Japanese occupation, their national identity systematically erased, their resources exploited, their people conscripted into forced labor, and much worse. The end of Japanese rule marked the beginning of a new chapter in Korean history. But the scars of occupation would take generations to heal. As the dust settled on the battlefields of World War II, the world took stock of the horrors that had unfolded across the globe. The atrocities committed by Imperial Japan in its pursuit of an empire were laid bare for all to see. Slave labor, indoctrination, sexual slavery, cultural assimilation, human experimentation, and outright genocide. The human cost of Japan's expansionism was devastatingly high, leaving a vile legacy of trauma and suffering that would echo through the ages. However, the new Japanese government put in place by the United States began to systematically whitewash its own history. The Japanese government codified into law strict regulation for Japanese children's education. This practice has been so successful that many Japanese citizens today quite literally don't know anything about Imperial Japan's atrocities on the world stage just 2 generations ago. This look back thorough the brutal history of Imperial Japan from the Meiji Restoration, to the countless wars fought for dominance, to the occupation and destruction of Korea and the eventual fall of Imperial Japan in 1945, is a stark reminder of the destructive power of unchecked expansionism and the human cost of a nation's hubris. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you haven't already, please consider liking, commenting and subscribing, as this helps the channel immensely. We upload new videos every Tuesday and Saturday. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our future projects. This is Two Perspectives, GCE, signing off.